morning. I gather some people had exciting evenings last night, so I hope everybody is feeling perky and awake. Thanks for having me. I am Emily Shorts. I'm currently Chief Product Officer at Spirit AI, which does two products, one of which is looking at human-to-human interaction and toxicity in games, and the other one is called Character Engine and is about building persuasive and interesting non-player characters. And there are a number of different things that we do with Character Engine. I'll talk about some of them today. The real focus of this is not just on what we're specifically doing, but on the use of natural language in games, and especially natural language input in games, because I had a pretty love-hate relationship with this space for my entire career. I started out playing and writing parser text adventures where people type inputs, and this is actually my very first game, Galatea, where you're typing to communicate with this character. And I've moved on from that, and I spent a lot of time in sort of more conventional video game spaces, and now I'm coming back to it as AI is opening up the potential for voice-driven interactions, a lot more conversational games, games that are written for smart speakers, games that are written for VR and AR contexts, where sort of conventional controllers don't really work. So at its worst, when you're asking a player to engage with your game using natural language, you can give them an experience that is confusing, that is undiscoverable, that doesn't understand them very well. You can give them a game where they're being asked to say things, but the system doesn't understand their voice or their accent or their choice of words. You can give them an experience where they really just have no idea what they're supposed to do and how they're allowed to do it. So there are a lot of things about that can be pretty painful. And as a developer, it's especially excruciating to watch somebody playing your game and having those experiences and just thinking, oh my God, like, no, type something else, like, why are you doing that? It can be a very frustrating space to design for. But at its best, it can also be really my favorite space to design for, because natural language allows people to be incredibly expressive. It allows people to say things that have concrete and specific meanings. It allows people to use their creativity, their imaginations. It allows people to express feelings and social meaning. And it allows them to do all of that very compactly. And having a game which has a natural language interface also means that the space of verbs that you can offer to your player is enormous, and the range of things that you can let the player do from moment to moment really varies over a huge space. So there's a lot of really lovely possibility here. So what I'm going to do today is look at some of the projects that are being done by other people and the design wisdom that's arising around that, some of the projects that we've done at Spirit and what our tooling is doing, and then I'm going to talk about how the tooling and the development of AI can support some of the design wisdom that is emerging in this space. So it's really both a design and a technology talk. And I'm going to intentionally leave a little bit of question time at the end so that if people want to dig more into either piece of that, we can get into that as well. All right, so things that are being developed in this space currently. There is a VR game called Starship Commander. David Cools gave a really good talk about this at a conference called Narroscope in Boston a few weeks back. His talk about it is available online. And it's a VR experience in which you are giving instructions to other people in your Starship space about what you want to do. And it's being driven by WIT AI, so understanding spoken input using a fairly chatbot-oriented kind of intent recognition system to understand what the player meant by what they said, and then implying a bunch of different models depending on what context is currently active in the story to determine what the intent probably currently means. So you can see a little bit of I just pulled this off of his slide, of their tooling and all of this sort of complex understanding of different intents. And he gives a bunch of useful advice about how to design for that space, which we'll come back to in a moment. Another good place to dig into for design input and guidance is a project called the Inspection Chamber. BBC R&D has been doing some really interesting work in interactive radio, interactive audio, because they have so much experience with the sort of radio play space. And how do you tell stories with audio? How do you do a good, engaging experience where the player is largely consuming it by listening? And the natural way to respond to that is with voice. So you've got a voice input, audio output experience that's designed for smart speakers. And the wonderful thing about BBC R&D is that because it is a publicly funded institution, they publish everything. They do their design information, they talk about what worked, what didn't work, what their user stats were, if there were design aspects of what they did that turned out to kind of suck. They will own up to that and tell you all of the details about that. So in contrast with a lot of game industry projects where you really can't get behind the scenes of what was successful and what wasn't, projects from these guys are really good. And on my personal blog, I recently posted audio of a talk from Henry Cook and Nikki Birch, who built this project, because they actually came and gave a talk at a meetup that I organized. So there's some further information about that that's available. Another really interesting thing that's being done in this space is a VR exploration by Square Enix R&D. So this is based on a talk given by Gautier Boeda, who is one of the researchers at Square Enix R&D in Japan. He came to the GDC 2019 AI Summit and spoke about the project that he's doing there. And in contrast with the two that I just mentioned, his project is much more focused on, instead of simulating a conversation with a character who's asking you questions and driving the interaction forward that way, it's an experience that's much closer to kind of a classic parser text adventure experience, in that you're giving instructions to this little alien buddy that you have. So it's in VR, you've got this space around you, you can see physical objects that you might want to manipulate, but you yourself aren't able to go and do it. You have to give instructions to this alien character. And so a lot of the research that's being done here is about how do we interpret what the player is saying, how do we understand that output as commands that are relevant to the space? So there's some really interesting work in this talk, if you dig into it, about how he's grounding the nouns and verbs that the player is using to specific reference in the VR environment. And then determining whether your alien buddy actually wants to carry out that command. So he's also got this cool underlying structure where the character is actually able to learn, hey, you asked me to pick up that live wire previously and it shocked me, so I don't want to do that again. So all of those things are coming into play in this project, and it's still very much at an R&D phase, but it's really interesting to look at what they're doing. And then finally, to come on to what we're doing with Character Engine. Character Engine is not a single game, it's not a single project, it's not targeted to only one platform. What we're doing is building a tool to create games that allow natural language or menu-based input and generate natural language output, that is the dialogue of the character that you're controlling. And the natural language output includes some metadata markup if you want it to, which would be driving things like, what is the emotional content of this dialogue? Do I want to drive some emotional speech? Do I want to change the animation of the face as I'm generating lip syncing? So there's a lot of kind of data out that's happening there. And then we're also modeling, where are we in the narrative? What's going on as we're progressing through the script? What is going on a social level? So we have a social model that allows the character to make decisions about how they want to respond to things. If you've just insulted me and I'm a very assertive person, I might react strongly to that. But if I'm a more meek person, or if I'm afraid of you, I might be more mild-mannered in response to it. And then we also have a knowledge model underlying it. So this gets back to this idea of there is an underlying world structure that we can refer to answer questions. So to give a kind of a sense of the range of things that we build with Character Engine, that can look like a lot of different things. So it can look like a visual novel with menu-based choices. This is one that we built where the player is able to select what emotion they want to express in the menu and get that set of options back and have the menu actually change depending on what they've decided they want to say. But then on things that are more on the natural language input side, because that's really our focus today, we've built a series of demonstrations. So, for instance, sorry, got off the previous one, one where you are interrogating a robot. This was actually our first demo. robot has seen a murder take place. It's a kind of iRobot type scenario, and you're going to ask her about what she saw and interrogate her heavily using the underlying knowledge model. But there are also moments where that conversation becomes more socially freighted or more narratively freighted, where she's asking you, do you think I did this? Or there's a kind of emotional undercurrent of whether she might be telling you the truth or lying. We've also built some things that are more in sort of enterprisey chatbot space. This is one where we've got a character who is kind of your concierge. This is not a very sort of high-tech front end, but you're just having this conversation with this character who's going to recommend movies to you. And one of the things that we've done with this is actually have this character's personality and their way of speaking be able to dynamically change using some generative grammar to change up its speech style. So if I say, like, it starts out randomly being very formal, but if I ask them to be more informal, their mode of speech changes. So there's lots of cool stuff that you can do with that, and it pairs in a really interesting way with natural language input, because you can actually adjust the character's output a little bit to match kind of the dialect tonality, the education level, the formality of the person who's speaking to it. So there are a lot of potential applications for this, especially in the educational space or for projects that are meant to go across multiple sort of contexts. So one of the things that some of our clients are really interested in is how do we present an interaction to a child or a student who might have a vocabulary anywhere on a range, or a level of grammatical understanding anywhere on a range, and then target the output to be more or less sophisticated depending on what we're trying to match here. So we're got that one. Or we can do things that are more like a sort of full-on classic video game. Some people have probably seen this one before.
You're Gordon.
We've got very dim audio here, sorry about that, but we're interacting with this character who is on a spaceship. She's asking us for help to get off the spaceship because it's about to be attacked by this evil empire. And what we're seeing is her head being driven, her mouth lip syncing automatically. The lip syncing is being generated to go with the dialogue that she has. And the actual display on the right side is showing how her dialogue is being generated. So which words is she choosing? At a high level, she's interpreting what we've said to her with classifiers, with entity identification, and so on, and then choosing what she wants to use to respond and how she wants to do that. Based on all of that, what I can talk about what we've done are our internal demos, so things that I just showed you just now. Some data that we got from demo users, and I'll go into those data sets a little bit more in a moment, and really vague generalizations about work that we're doing for clients and other people's work. But I can't talk very much about any of the work that we've done for other companies under NDA or certain details of how our system works. So in terms of data sets that we can look at or draw conclusions from today, there are a couple of particularly large sets of data that we have for the two sort of 3D style demos that I just showed you. So we took the robot interrogation demo to GDC and collected a whole bunch of inputs from people who were playing it at our booth over a 3-day period, amounting to nearly 10,000 inputs, of which 6,500 of those inputs were unique. So there was really quite a wide variety of what people were trying to say to this character and how they were interacting with her. We also have a set of data from beta testers that we collected in the period leading up to that demo, but that data is a little bit more suspect in certain ways, and I'll talk about how that is. But the interesting thing about the interrogation log files from GDC is that they were all collected under the same circumstances by users who were approaching that space, playing it on the same hardware. So there was a lot of kind of common baseline to what they were actually able to do with it. And that also meant there were, several hundred people interacted with this as well, so a much larger set than we are often getting if we're just doing a beta test internally or a QA project internally. So people who are interacting with this character, what we found from our beta testers was that we got utterances with a spike of one-word utterances, so people saying sort of hi, yes, no, their names, stuff like that. You get a drop-in length, you get another peak at 4 words. And part of the reason for this is that this character was designed to understand questions, and that was really the main modality of interacting with her. And so a lot of the questions that people came up with would be things like, well, who was this character? So that would be 3 words long. Who was a character with 2 names? What was the blah, blah, blah? So there were a lot of occasions where that kind of standard structure of what people were saying would kind of wind up at 4. So this is our beta testers. What we actually saw at the trade show was slightly different. So just to kind of compare, spike at 1 in the beta tester data set, and then a much lower kind of level of 1-word inputs, and really heavy emphasis on the 4 or 5-word inputs. And then we also see there's still a strong drop-off statistically in what people are saying that are at longer lengths. But what we get out there is there are some people who just really wanted to say these very complicated things to her, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. We also saw in sort of real use cases a fair amount of button mashing. Sometimes people clearly just wanted to see what would happen if they hit the keyboard when the character realized that they weren't sincerely making inputs. We saw a lot of people who just typed pure punctuation. Well, I say a lot. There's sort of 20 or 30 cases of things that were just punctuation inputs, a lot of hi and hello, a fair amount of yes and no, but actually much less yes and no than questions. And again, that reflects the way that this interaction was structured. And then a number of people were actually using punctuation marks. So there were a lot of people who actually put question marks on their sentences. There were some people who actually put exclamation points when they were having a conversation that felt significant to them. And I'm going to come back to that because this is a way that our data in this context actually differs quite a lot from data that's taken in other contexts, and it affects kind of what we're able to do with that input. So to kind of cover some other differences qualitatively in what was in here, the beta users swore at this poor robot way more than the people at the trade show did. Some of the things that beta testers said to this robot were brutal. They're so rude that I'm not willing to show them to you on a slide. I'm not kidding, right? So, I think part of what arises, so I think there are 2 reasons for this. One is, if you're beta testing something, you're probably playing multiple sessions of it, you probably get quite tired of it. The sort of animosity level rises, and so people were expressing themselves that way. I think the other thing was, though, that we were testing out how well this character seemed to respond emotionally to negative emotional input, so there was kind of an incentive for beta testers to try abusing her and see if she'd react negatively, which people at the trade show didn't necessarily have those same incentives. They might have incentives instead to try and progress the story, and only in some circumstances would they really feel that it was useful to kind of beat up on her. Or if they were really getting frustrated, what we would sometimes see as a pattern in the data was them being abusive, and then that was like the last turn of the interaction. They're like, you suck, I'm done, this is over. Beta logs contain lots more repetition of the exact same phrasing. People will tell you when testing and developing natural language input games that you need to have a wide range of participants using your games because you'll get the same phrasing if you use the same people. I think this is more pronounced even than people would assume or realize, just from being told that. If we looked at our beta logs, the number of times that beta testers would be using the exact same question or sentence phrasing, even though there were lots of different ways they could have phrased that. They're asking the same general type of question, and they've even been told, please intentionally try to use different phrasings and input. People just sort of settle into kind of patterns when they're talking to something. I'm saying the same things to the same person over and over again. Eventually, I'm just going to settle into doing it the same way over and over. So this is really sort of an important point about the non-novelty of what you're getting out of beta testers and how much you need to diversify your beta tester pool. And this was even with a pool of, I think we had 15 people, some of them within Spirit, some of them an external partner, and some of them friends and family. But even so, the beta logs show lots of repetition. As I said, non-beta users do a lot more keyboard mashing. I think that's sort of a thing that you do when you interact with this kind of system for the very first time. Non-beta users don't necessarily know or heed the limits of the system. This one's fairly obvious, but I think it accounts for why we got a lot of longer inputs in the trade show stuff, because sometimes people would think, all right, I'm going to actually make a philosophical comment to this robot. and maybe they expected it to understand, maybe they didn't, maybe they were exploring the limits, but beta testers tended not to get into that too much. And non-beta users were worse typists, as it happens, or maybe it was just uncomfortable standing up at a trade show booth. Another interesting thing that emerged from the data set from general public conversation was there was a certain pattern towards particular types of utterance that were trying to drive the dialogue in a particular way. So we got complaints about understanding, you misunderstood me, I don't think you get what I'm saying, those kinds of things, which we actually then went off and built a classifier for to try and, can we detect this type of intent? Complaints about the robot not being forthcoming. So it's a little bit different from being misunderstood, but it was kind of like getting into that emotional back and forth. And certainly this is something that really arises from the nature of the story we were telling. We were telling you a story in which this robot might or might not be a faithful witness. The player has a sort of natural contextual reason to maybe want to play bad cop or kind of pressure her a little bit, or just sort of accuse her of not being very useful. But it's something that can arise even in other contexts, kind of as a reflection of this feeling of like, this conversation is not really working the way that it needs to be working, and that's something that's useful to keep an eye on. Another thing that we got a lot was just requests to continue. So there are people who, like, we had quite a few entries that were just ellipses, or people saying go on or and. Sometimes people would use the exact same noun or noun phrase that the character just said and a question mark because they wanted to kind of be like, okay, go on about that, like tell me more about that. And it was interesting to me, I think this reflects a kind of design point that I'll come back to in a few minutes, but it seemed to me like this was something that people relied on as a way of indicating I'm a little lost. I'm not like completely lost, but I'm a little unsure what I can productively do next in this interaction, which is something that occurs a lot in natural language interchanges, and we want to have a good way to respond to that. And it's basically a way for the player to hand conversational initiative back to the other speaker in the context of a turn-taking conversation. And then there were a number of challenges to statements. So that can't be right. How do you know? What are you talking about? So things where the character said something that felt like it might be incorrect. And she did have some information where if you interrogated her, she would realize that there was an inherent contradiction and she would correct her understanding of what was going on. So that was something that did also kind of arise naturally from the content of the story. All right, so that's one data set. Another is we did a similar thing with the Spaceship Commander. Spaceship Commander is the name of another example, but Aota, which is who happens to be the commander of a spaceship, coincidentally, and very inconveniently for this talk. So for that one, we were running same period of time at a booth at GDC. We had fewer sessions of using this particular demo because we were also running a menu-based demo at the same time. So people who came to the booth were splitting their attention between those two. So since I'm only using the natural language input context for this conversation, it's actually a smaller data set somewhat. So we only, instead of having about 10,000 inputs, we've only got a little over 3,000 spread over a couple of hundred distinct sessions. But median interaction is about 3¼ minutes. That's not too bad, given that this demo only ran for sort of 3 to 5 minutes, depending on what you did, maybe 6. So quite a number of people were actually completing this interaction and sticking with it long enough to get somewhere with it. And then I also have a little bit more qualitative experience that I'll be drawing on in my later observations from the following vaguely described non-NDA breaking projects. So we did a project which was for an educational context. The client wanted us to build something that was about ordering a restaurant meal as part of a language teaching context. So that's something where the point of the interaction was really getting the user to engage in a linguistic way with the social scenario that they actually already know quite well. Another is a gameplay project that, in addition to other kinds of input, accepts emoji. So that was kind of fun to work with because there are lots of things that you can do with kind of the ambiguity, but also the kind of emotional resonances of emoji inputs. And that's probably the one I'm saddest that I can't show you because it's super fun. We've done some projects that allow spoken input with text-to-speech. This is actually kind of a placeholder for multiple things, but my point here is like, yes, or speech-to-text rather. We have done some things where we ask the player to speak to the system, and the way that people interact with that tends to be a bit different in ways that I'll summarize in a minute. We have the MovieBox chatbot character that I mentioned and showed you a little bit before, which is that kind of concierge character. And then an in-progress character that talks about Spirit's own work. So there's actually quite a number of different projects that we've done in the past several years where we've had an opportunity to see what seems to be working for people, what seems to be engaging people, how do our beta testers react to this, how does the client and the client's audience react, and so on. And then just before I kind of move off the general topic of Character Engine, for people who are curious what this actually looks like, this is what the tool looks like. You're creating a dialogue script that has player input lines that have classification associated with them. So if you look into a particular conversation move, what the author is writing is a sample input, like, this is the kind of thing that I want to understand. And then the system is saying, okay, well, this is matching a couple of classifiers that I recognize. It's matching some keywords or some names of objects that you've mentioned in your world. And so this is what I'm going to use as kind of the fingerprint of this utterance that I'm going to use to match if the player says something. And then we also have a wide range of different classifiers. So I mentioned, based on the robot interaction and the data we collected from that we were kind of inspired to create some additional classifiers for things like, did the player accept or reject the last line of input? Did they seem to agree with what was just said, or did they seem to disagree? Did they express some sort of negative about being misunderstood? So things like that. And so we have a number of classifiers of this kind that we've built ourselves, but Character Engine is also able to plug into other people's classifiers, into intent recognition systems such as Dialogflow or Watson, and also into per project classifiers. So we have done things, and the emoji case is an example, where we built classifiers that are specific to the project that we're doing and plug those in as well. So that means we're using natural language understanding strategies such as sort of standard intent recognition. Are we trying to understand commands to the system? Are we trying to understand conversational intent? Are we trying to understand social intent, greetings, thanks, apologies, things like that? Those are areas where they don't necessarily arise very frequently. So apologies and thanks appeared very rarely in the data sets for both the robot case and the IATA case. But when they did occur, it was a pretty emotionally fraught moment that we wanted to make sure that we were really paying off. So there's kind of like trade-off between those kinds of importance. We're doing some things that are looking at a deeper, at sentences at a deeper semantic level, and working out what kind of structured query we want to make to our knowledge model, so that's also a possibility. We're doing some things where we're applying sentiment analysis, and I'll come back to where that's been useful. This is a case where I was initially extremely dubious of the usability of sentiment analysis in the gameplay context, because a lot of the behavior of sort of sentiment analysis currently tends to be trained on data sets that are about reviewing products online. They tend to be very focused on that kind of commercial space. They tend not to map very well to gameplay context, and they also tend not to work necessarily very well on individual lines of input. Some of them are better than others, but some of them are really trained for larger bodies of input. So I was fairly dubious about what we could do with this, but I think we found some interesting design spaces in which it can be usefully applied, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But often what we find that we're doing is that we're specifically training our sentiment analysis for the particular work that we're working with, or we're taking some existing sentiment analysis data and modifying it or making some tweaks. How excited or bored is the player? And that's something where we get lots of, there are different kinds of signals that we can get off that. Obviously, if somebody is actually willing to type an exclamation point, then they're trying to tell us something by doing that. And similarly, if people are repeating the same word frequently multiple times in a single line of input, if they're typing multiple lines of dialogue input in a single line, those things tend to signal stronger engagement. And similarly, when you have kind of voice input, you can take some information just out of like the qualities of the audio. Is it loud? Is it energetic? Is it quick? Is it slow? Pacing and those kinds of things can also affect our understanding of how much the player seems to be leaning forward. And then the sort of obverse of that, how frustrated is the user right now? That's really important information. And there are sort of keys into user frustration. I wouldn't say that we have this one nailed, but it's something that we come back to and look at again and again because it's really useful to be able to try and figure out when does the user seem to be having a bad natural language experience. They're not being understood, or they don't know what to say, or they don't really understand well enough what's going on in the story. And sometimes those kind of intermediate pieces of feedback, like go on or continue or please, those kinds of things, combined with inputs that are trying to check the status of the world or be reminded of what's going on. Sometimes people type help. Sometimes they ask questions about what's happening. And those things mean that the player is still engaged enough to be asking those questions, be trying to figure out how to interact with this experience, but they aren't necessarily sort of fully understanding what's going on. And we need to be aware that they might be kind of getting stuck in some way. All right, so based on all of that, some observations about the design space. Writing natural language experiences for games versus other chatbots. Number one, real-world information doesn't necessarily apply. If I'm setting the game on a spaceship, if I'm setting the game on an alien world, if I'm setting it in a fantasy environment, I don't necessarily have the opportunity to make use of the real-world data sets that are available that somebody might be using in a chatbot context. And in particular, that means that strategies that exist for out-of-domain answers in kind of enterprise chatbot cases or sort of general conversational chatbot cases, those don't necessarily work because they're often based on trying to use a large data set of pre-existing real-world domain knowledge, which doesn't necessarily transfer. Another huge issue about entering this design space is the problem of protagonist characterization. Like if you're interacting with a chatbot on a website and you're talking to it about how you hate your mobile phone and you really wish that they would like fix your account, that conversation, you may be annoyed, you may be frustrated, you may be having a hard time with that interaction, but you're not playing anybody else. You are you. And you don't have to know anything else that you didn't come to that conversation with. But if you're trying to invite somebody to play a game world in which you're asking them to role play, which is one of the wonderful things that people can do with natural language, you have to equip them with some sort of understanding of what their situation is, and you have to do it really quickly. And this is already a challenge with sort of normal, with game design for menu-based interaction. It's already a challenge giving the protagonist, the player, an understanding of who they are and what their situation is. But if you don't even have the choices of a menu to use to prime the user with that information, it becomes even more challenging. On the plus side, fictional characters have their own goals. Character goals can drive the narrative. So we have some ways of pushing back on out-of-domain input. This is something that David Kuhl's talking about Starship Commander talks about a lot, that they created an interaction that was a very kind of tightly timed thriller space where you don't have time to sit around and talk about, people's mom's favorite color. You just need to focus on getting through the situation that you're in, and that helps control the amount of content. And then things that we find just within the range of natural language input games. Speech inputs. People tend to speak briefly. They tend to use keywords or noun phrases only. They've often been trained by Siri and Alexa to expect that the system isn't necessarily going to understand them very well, that they need to use short terms and that they need to speak very clearly. And often they're completely right about that. So, it's not even something that that one should resent about the player's expectations, but it's just a reality. So if you're designing content to respond to that, often that design is quite different, even though it might seem like it should be similar to the design that you might use for typed input. Typed input on phones still tends to be on the briefer side, but it also kind of taps into people's expectations about chatting and about the informality of the UI. So often what we see in sort of data that we pull from interactions on phones is that people will be using more LOLs, more emoticons. There were only 2 emoticons in the entire robot data input. On phones, you get a lot more of that kind of stuff. So you get that kind of brevity, which is actually often very useful from a design and creation point of view, but you also have informality. And informality of speech means you have less context to work with, which tends to be an interesting challenge for making sure that you're correctly interpreting the player. And then on keyboards, you get longer and more formal input. So this is the kind of data that we saw in both of the two examples that I was able to talk about the data sets in more detail, because you had somebody sitting there with a keyboard. They've got the time, the space, the sort of flexibility to write out entire lines of dialogue accusing people of things. And then the other other thing about this design space to think about is the distinction between puzzle and task interaction, which is what we tend to see in parser-based games, and in examples like the Square Enix R&D work that I was talking about earlier, where the player knows what they're trying to do, there is some underlying systematic knowledge representation about the world that allows your system to respond consistently, which is very useful. The player may not know how to interact best with that world model to start with, but it's something that is systematic enough that they can learn it, and they can acquire that ability. So that can be very useful, but at the other hand, it has a large potential for frustration as well. If they really want to do something specific in that space, they may bounce off it if they just can't figure out how to do it. And then on the other hand, you've got things that are designed as dialogue flow interactions first and foremost. So the example of the inspection chamber, they talked a lot about how the NPC knows what the player is supposed to do. The situation that you're in this story is that you've actually been picked up by some alien researchers, and they're trying to find out who or what you are. And they're not really familiar with the concept of humans. And so they're asking you a bunch of questions, and their questions are a bit off the wall, and they're very much driving this interaction and controlling what goes on. So they're very specific, not only about, here's the question I'm asking you, but here are the kinds of answers that I would be able to take in. And the meaning of what the player is saying is incredibly contextual. It's very much like at this one node of the dialogue, what you're saying means one thing. If you said that same word later on, it might not be relevant or particularly recognized. And then there's a space which is the one that I actually find the most kind of promising from a pure interactive narrative perspective, which is the space of merging those interaction styles, of having a character that you're interacting with that does have a social agenda, a narrative purpose, something that they're trying to accomplish. They might ask you pointed questions at particular moments. You might have those sort of intense instances where they say, okay, tell me the truth. Do you think I murdered this person? Do you really love me? Those sort of tight drama moments, but where they actually can open out enough at other times to answer general questions about lore, to let you say, so, you're asking me to go kill this dragon. Well, how dangerous is it? So I really like that kind of merged interaction style, and some of what we've done with the design of Character Engine is work towards supporting that. So creating a tool in which it's possible to have really controlled understanding of what the player is saying and doing at particular moments of high dramatic tension, but at the same time have the underlying knowledge model be robust enough and responsive enough that the player can go back to asking those questions. And as we saw in the robot demo, a lot of the sort of standard interactions, especially in something like a mystery story, are going to be the player leading the task of coming to a knowledge about the world, which is something that an underlying system can be really useful for. All right. So, design strategies in this space that are generally recommended, and then some thoughts about how AI approaches can either help or be helped by design strategies. So one of the things that we were talking about a little bit earlier, and that David Coultz talks about a bit, is this idea of we're using this context to really constrain what the player should say. And that's going to help them understand that they should not go off into random small chat. To some extent, the context of kind of a cocktail party is one of the scarier things you could try and build, because you've got the first couple of interactions are very socially controlled and easy to predict. Hi, I'm so-and-so, how are you doing, what do you do? And by the time, as soon as you get out of the super generic, this is my job title space, suddenly a world opens up in which people could say anything, and you really need the drink in your hand. Sorry, that was a joke. I'm not a massive alcoholic, just FYI. that kind of context can be really challenging, whereas if you've got something with a really strong narrative, you can be driving that forward. This is something that enterprise chatbots rely on a lot too, right? But the context there is, I'm trying to sell you a mortgage, or I'm trying to, recharge your phone account or something. So using context with a really strong kind of narrative purpose is very helpful. Thrillers, high-pressure scenes, mysteries that encourage targeted explorations, NPC moods and motives that justify them not wanting to go off topic. We're trying to defuse this bomb. Don't ask me about other things. NPCs who are motivated to work with you. And then just the familiar social contexts do provide a really useful framework as well. So I was saying Cocktail Party is a bad example of a social framework, but the restaurant situation that we did, that was good, because you could get situations where you would have a little chat back and forth with the waiter about like nearby places in town you might want to see, or like what do you recommend, I'm a vegan, and so on. But there's a kind of really clear cadence to ordering and eating a meal at a restaurant. And so if ever the player felt like they didn't really know what was going on, they could go back to that. And similarly, we could have the NPC drive us back onto the beats of that interaction as well, because, all right, well, we've had enough conversation about the weather. Let's talk about whether you're ordering an entree. Okay. Some interesting things come out, though, if you set up contextual situations. So we were thinking when we built the robot interrogation, like this is a case where it's really clear what you're trying to do. You're trying to solve a mystery by asking questions about a tightly defined set of things that you can be curious about in a murder. Like, what is the means? What is the motive? What is the opportunity? Like, people understand that at a very basic level, and they tend to ask questions about who people are, where they were, why they were doing what they were doing, and we felt like that was pretty nicely defined. The trick was that a lot of our players decided that they had sophisticated hypotheses that they wanted to put to the robot, which we had not necessarily anticipated. So sometimes they would ask about aspects of the scenario or situation that we hadn't really framed out. So we had this sort of backstory that the robot has received a blow to the head and therefore it doesn't remember everything. And people would get really particular about that. Sometimes people would get inventive and lyrical. What song was in your head when you delivered the blow? It's like, well, that's an interesting question, but I don't know what to do with that. And then really kind of higher level emotive and metaphorical things. Did she treat you like her daughter? Well, who can say? Or this accusation of like, this person's getting into the role playing, right? Robo scum. Right, great player engagement. We did not know how to handle that one. And then, kind of the meta hypothesis, which was correct, by the way. So there are sort of challenges that arise around this. And supporting this with tools and tech, so this slide, the fact that there is one bullet point, can you even see the bullet points from there? It kind of gives away that this is an area where I'm still doing a lot of thinking about it. There are projects like the Scheherazade project at Georgia Tech where they're doing crowdsourced input on kind of how do particular situations play out, so you can kind of build a body of information about that. There are other strategies for creating social models to kind of tell you what should happen. You can do analysis of movies and books, things that are in a similar space, and that is also useful because your players are often engaging with particular tropes. But this is very challenging because, as we saw in the sort of hypothesis case, the more people kind of lean into the story you're telling them, the more they tend to want to imaginatively explore and kind of join with you in the fan-fictional creation of your universe, which is awesome, but also poses a lot of challenges. Communicating about expected inputs. So introductions are critical and need the most guidance, especially in contexts where the player doesn't necessarily know the protagonist's role. I mentioned this earlier. If you are doing some guidance, you want to transition out of it gently. So one of the things that we found with this demo is we knew we needed to set the player's expectations and understanding about what was happening. So we started out by having the player say, hey, are you so-and-so? Right? Yes, no question. It's easy to say yes. Most players did say yes and didn't say no, which is interesting. Like, they seem to immediately understand, all right, you're being cast in this role, accept the role. Occasionally people would challenge it, but usually not until the second playthrough. But what happened then was the most common place for people to stop playing, if they did abandon the session before finishing, was the point after several sort of back and forth questions where the NPC makes a statement rather than asking a question. They felt like they didn't know what to do. And then if you're providing that kind of guidance, guide without blocking. And so I mentioned that we have this example that we're building, which is a conversation about Spirit's own products. And so we've got this sort of set of menu items, but we also have the opportunity for the player to type topic words or keywords they want to talk about, and when they do that, it changes the content of the menu. So when she asks, like, do you know much about Character Engine, there are several ways of saying yes, but if you type the word no, it will change this up. This is still in progress, so I don't have a lot of kind of data for us yet about how people are reacting to that, but the combination of being able to show what words were recognized, we acknowledge what was understood, but we also get guidance about what to do. And giving the player feedback on individual words and emotions that were communicated can be quite powerful. Providing some UI support around the conversation history. And then if you are using that kind of technique that I just showed you a moment ago, being careful about the gap between what you want to understand and what you want to prompt. So we, to account for sort of situations where this character, we might actually have somebody interacting with them in an antagonistic way. I apologize for this vocabulary. It changes her line of dialogue. But you notice when that was being typed, like the option of the rude word did not appear as a thing to encourage somebody with. It just acknowledged that it existed. And then she changes into a sadder text-to-speech voice when you do that to her because she's very unhappy. Okay. So I need to hurry up and stop talking, but the other point that I wanted to make here was that you want to soften your turn-taking. So one of the other things that we see is you get the standard advice from Alexa designers that you should avoid rhetorical questions because people will try to answer at a point when the device is not listening and they'll get confused and frustrated. And similarly, as we saw in the example I was just talking about, there can be a problem if an NPC makes a statement with no obvious or immediate next steps to take. The player kind of feels like they've been abandoned. However, the annoying/awesome thing, and basically everything about natural language is annoying/awesome, if the player does have something to say at that moment where the NPC has just handed them freedom, often those are the really high engagement moments. So there are the moments where the NPC has said something vulnerable and the player responds with "aw," or the NPC has said something frightening and the player responds with some emotional feedback, or the NPC has mentioned something that exists in the world and the player follows up by asking about what that is. Like, those moments are high engagement, so you don't want to make them completely impossible to reach, but you don't want to strand people in those moments either. So one of the other techniques that we're looking at is that kind of, it's your turn, but I'm going to take the turn back again if you don't respond so immediately. So creating a little bit more fluidity, not going all the way to modeling all of the complexity of genuine human real-time turn-taking, but just kind of exploring some of that as well. Okay, so I have one or two other sententious ideas here, but I will skip them in the interest of time, and if people have questions, we can get to that.
We have microphones over here. No? Yes? Oh, I thought we had this.
Yeah.
I guess we have time for another 7 minutes of questions.
Clearly, the question and answer model that you're generally using in the examples means that there's an underlying knowledge model for the agent. But it also has to build one for the player, the interrogator. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And, can you talk a little bit more about how it reasons about what the player, for instance, maybe recognizing that the player doesn't know something when it's being quizzed about it, and then eliding that or trying to mislead?
Yeah, so there are several things that we do. We track whether a particular entity in the knowledge model has been mentioned. And that can be either by the NPC or by the player. So if you type something as input and it hasn't otherwise come up, it will mark that you seem to know about that, which is a kind of shortcut to acknowledging if you're replaying what's going on. And then we also do some modeling of specific facts about the entities and whether that information has been exposed or not. And then the text itself, so what I didn't really get into here at all is that we have a very sort of rich generative grammar means of producing the output, which means that we can vary the text to reflect like I'm telling you this fact for the first time, or I'm taking it as read that you already know this. We can do things like have different productions for the names of a character depending on whether they've been introduced before. So for instance, in the robot demo, when you're interacting with her, the first time that she mentions the person who created her, she will say, like, you know, my creator, Dr. Alicia Chastain, blah, blah, blah. Wherever that occurs, she'll phrase it that way. And then when she, you know, refers to it again, it'll just be Alicia or she, depending on the pronoun status. There's probably a lot more that I could get into on that, but is that...
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to what extent would it be useful to introduce a third party into the conversation to help keep things moving sometimes?
That can also be very helpful. So you get this sort of Trippin, Grace, and Facade, they'll bicker with each other if the player doesn't say anything kind of thing. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a possibility. The sort of, it's something where we've used it lightly thus far. Like a lot of the things that we have really leaned into have been one-to-one interactions. So there's an example that we've done where it's 1-to-2, and then you get the kind of like playful byplay between the two other characters and things like that. The trick is like trying to find that ideal balance where you don't want the player to start to feel that they're unheard or that they're unnecessary in the scene. So there's always a design back and forth there.
So I would imagine that when people are interacting with something they know to be an AI, that they will talk differently to how they would if they're talking to a human. Is that something that you've found?
Yes.
And if so, do you consider that to be a challenge to game design, and how would you go about addressing that? Well,
I mean, okay, so I think implied in your question is the implication that it would be better if they talked as though to humans. Is that what you're suggesting, or? I can just riff on this topic without assuming any, okay. So it's definitely true that people, you know, kind of are focused on what am I trying to do in this transaction. They tend, except when they're intentionally testing boundaries or kind of getting into role-playing, they tend to try to stay on the tracks. In the sense of like say something that it's going to get, and if you actually like compare human to human chat data, which we also have a lot of because our other product is all about human to human interaction. If you compare those things, like the way people talk to each other, especially online, especially teenagers, is like incomprehensible to a machine. Just really, but I mean the thing that goes with that is that it probably wouldn't lead to a very good game experience either, because a lot of solid game experiences are about the player having enough understanding of the possibility space that they can have intentionality, they can have agency. So in that regard, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that players sort of automatically adapt themselves. It's quite useful that they do. If they didn't, that would be hard. But I think we also, you know, can just be honest with ourselves that what we're providing there is an experience that is, you know, perhaps a conversational game. It's still very different from a conversation with your friend, and that's fine.
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
The quality of the natural language generation that we saw in your talk is really high, and I have a feeling that that is because you can extract a lot of rich information from the natural language understanding, right, that is built in these games. Would you say that we can't separate those two things if we want to make natural language generation for games?
Yes. So I didn't, you know, I thought about having two halves of this talk and have one of them be about input and one of them be about output, and that would have been like a 4-hour-long talk, so I decided to not do that. But, you know, as I showed at the very beginning, we do things where it's pure menu input and dialogue generation output. And the strategies that we use for that, so there's, as I was saying, there's a generative grammar. The generative grammar is able to pull information from the knowledge model. It's able to change things up. And then a lot of the kind of enhancements that we're able to bring into that space are about bringing AI techniques into the tooling, into the authoring process, rather than into the runtime. Because what we've generally found is, both in terms of performance and in terms of the predictability of the output, although there are some really super awesome language models out there these days, they're still not things that you would want to or be able to plug into a game. But they are things you can potentially plug into the tool in the right circumstances. So the tooling as it stands now, can do a lot of suggestions about maybe you want to consider this synonym, maybe you want to do things like that, suggest variations on the output side. So it's like, well, you're using the color red, I can give you, 5 other forms of red. If you are not careful, you can go to town with that and produce something that's completely unidiomatic and really weird sounding. So there are ways to push that are not good, or at least they're not good unless you like that aesthetic. But yeah, basically, there are a lot of interesting things to do, some that we're already doing and some that we have in a kind of research phase.
Right. I think at this time we need to move on to the next session. So thank you, Emily.